Okay, now I always try to keep a Canadian focus as much as possible and to bring in Canadian content as much as possible. But in discussing inequality, it is relevant to broaden that and take a look at the rest of the world. Global inequality. Do we have poor people in Canada? Of course we do. Do we have thousands of people living below the low income cutoff in Canada? Yes, we do. At the same time, Canada is one of the richest countries in the world. So, with this in mind, although there is absolutely poverty in Canada, what it means to be poor in our country is relative. It is very, very different, for example, from what it means to be poor in India or in some African countries. There is a great, great documentary on Netflix. It's a series called Daughters of Destiny that follows young schoolgirls over a 7 year period from the untouchable caste in India, the lowest caste, who have been selected to attend the Shanti Bhavan school in an effort to break the cycle of poverty. Um, and what this school does is, for the children that attend, they will even only take one child from each family. They won't take more than one child from each family because they're trying to ensure that their effect reaches as far as possible. And watching this series, so it's not just a 1 or 2 hour documentary, it's episodes. When it shows you the girls going home for breaks, you can clearly see the kind of poverty they come from. Nothing like what we consider poor in Canada. In Canada, being poor refers to those low income cutoffs. While in India or Egypt or the Philippines, being poor might mean picking through a garbage dump every day to find anything of value or living on the streets with no shelter whatsoever. So not only has the income gap between the lower class and the upper class grown within Canada and the United States, so has the income gap between the 20 or so of the world's richest countries and the rest of the world, between the richer countries in the world and the poorer countries. Why is that? Why is it that some countries seem to have so much while others have so little and seem to be almost incapable of changing their financial situation? Modernization theory is functionalism's take on this. And they say that global inequality is caused by a combination of factors. That these poor countries that seem to be trapped in this cycle of poverty, that seem unable to change their social situation or their economic situation, have certain dysfunctional characteristics. And this is why they are always in the situation that they're in. So modernization theory refers to lack of investment capital, lack of Western style business techniques, lack of a stable Western government, and lack of a Western mentality. So, say what now? Let's deconstruct this a bit to make it simpler and straightforward. When modernization theory says that in part, global inequality is caused by a lack of investment capital, what this simply means is that in poor countries, their citizens individually, as well as the countries as a whole, simply don't have the money for startup. They don't have the capital necessary to invest in Western style businesses or Western style agriculture that they know would lead them to more profit for their country as a whole or for individuals. But they just don't have the money to get it going. So people in poorer countries may want to do things differently. They may want to farm in a more modern or efficient manner that would produce higher returns, probably with less manual labor required, but they simply don't have the money to invest in what is necessary to farm in that way. They don't have the startup money to make the change. If they work in the business side of things, they just don't have the money to invest in themselves, in their businesses, and their employees. So they keep working the way they always have because they don't have the money necessary to modernize, which they know would lead them to do better for themselves and their families. According to functionalism's modernization theory, another problem is that these poorer countries often don't have a more modern Western style approach to business in regards to how they market themselves, how they deal with customers, how they handle the finances associated with their business, which again would lead to better profits and more efficiency. But because they lack this modern approach, their situation remains unchanged. They remain in a poorer position. They are not as productive as they could be if they modernized, and they don't make as much money um, that would then give them the ability to pull themselves up the ladder of social stratification. So you have this lack of investment capital that keeps these countries poorer, and they don't utilize better business techniques. Modernization theory also states that global inequality is caused in part by attitude, lack of a more modern Western attitude, mentality, meaning the overall attitude one needs in order to be successful. Instead, modernization theory says in these poorer countries there's less emphasis on saving and planning for the future, less emphasis on investing for the future, on education, on being motivated. And included in this is the lack of recognition that it's not beneficial to continue to have children when you simply can't afford to. But they do anyways. And that's why I have this picture of Africa up here with the average fertility rate in Africa. If you look at the bottom of it, the legend, and it shows you how many children on average women have. So some may have less, but this also means this is an average. Some may have more than this. Having more children when one can barely afford the necessities of life for the ones you already have is, according to modernization theory, part of the lack of a modern Western attitude. And finally, modernization theory states that the governments of these countries that experience a lot of poverty simply don't provide their citizens the stability needed that would make the country attractive to investment overall. So with this picture, there's a legend at the upper right-hand corner showing by color code how volatile these countries are, how stable their governments are. I had to have a little giggle that Canada is blue, considered sustainable, and that the States is just stable. They're not as, they're apparently a little bit more volatile than we are. This is why foreign aid is often provided from one government to another, in an effort to help the countries develop more of a secure framework for businesses to grow, more of a secure framework for these countries to develop the infrastructure they need for investment. Now, I want to point out something here. I keep referring to a modern Western way of doing things. And I hope at some point during that rant you thought to yourself, well, Jennifer, why should these countries and the people within them have to change their way of doing things? Isn't that just trying to make everybody like us? Isn't that a very ethnocentric approach? And I can understand why you might think that, because I kind of think the same thing. But the key here is functionalism is not saying these things from an ethnocentric perspective. They're not saying other people should be more like us and their way of doing things is just wrong. Functionalism is saying these things from the perspective of maximizing profits, leading to further investment, leading to the ability to make more profits, and provide countries the ability to pull the majority of its citizens out of poverty. So functionalism is saying these things, recognizing that as the world evolves and the way the world functions changes, so too do the people within it need to be open to change and improvement. So that is functionalism's perspective. Big surprise, conflict theory disagrees. Conflict theory says that inequality is the result of patterns of domination and submission between rich and poor countries. It really focuses on the inequality, on the unfairness of the inequality, and states that global inequality is the result of this. This is called dependency theory, first developed in the late 50s when a researcher realized that increases in the wealth of richer nations seemed to be at the expense of poorer nations. Much like the upper class have exploited the lower class. According to conflict theory, richer countries have exploited poorer countries. Now, dependency theory starts by pointing out that historically speaking, more powerful countries have in fact explored and taken over less powerful countries. Colonialization. Sometimes they would colonize other countries, annex them to their own, but in many cases they would simply subdue them and take control. And in doing so, this more powerful country would then take over and use the resources from poorer, undeveloped, or underdeveloped countries, making use of them, enriching themselves at the expense of the other. So this is in a way what Karl Marx said about the rich upper class and the poor working class, but on a bigger scale. It's the exploitation of labor. It's the exploitation of poor countries making use of their labor and resources. And we're talking about three kinds of countries here. Core countries are us. We are the capitalist countries. These provide the vast majority of technology and capital in the world. Core countries are modern, they are advanced, they are technologically literate, they are westernized countries. On the other end of the spectrum are the peripheral countries. These are the countries that we would call third world, that are impoverished, and they are a major source of the world's raw materials and cheap labor. And then in between these two extremes are semi-peripheral countries. These are countries that were former colonies, but who have made a lot of progress and have become more prosperous. But they haven't progressed to the point of being a core country. So dependency theory states that instead of a division of labor between classes, there is a division of labor between countries, between the richer core countries and the poorer peripheral countries, and that over time the richer core countries exploit their dominance over the increasingly impoverished periphery. Now, dependency theory takes this a step further and clearly states that economic growth in advanced countries like Canada does not lead to growth in poorer countries. Just like a factory making a lot of money doesn't lead to its workers enjoying a higher salary. They get paid what they get paid. Instead, the economic activity of the richer countries leads to serious economic problems in the poorer countries. And in large part, they're poor because they're used as producers of raw materials or to serve as a supply of cheap labor. And they're denied the opportunity to market the resources in any way that competes with richer countries. So I thought this map was quite effective. It shows you generally what each country is mainly used for. So even though times have changed, even though many of the countries that were previously colonized have gained their independence politically speaking, they are still quite poor. And it doesn't have to be like this. Your text points out that Taiwan and Korea at one time were colonies of Japan until 1945. But while they were colonies, instead of just kind of using the countries up, instead of Japan just using these countries as sources of cheap labor and for resource extraction, Japan took a different approach and purposely built up their economies. They made huge improvements regarding transportation, improving communication networks, in building up the infrastructure of these two countries. So, here we go. Let's pull this all together from the start. We talked about what social stratification is, and then I looked at patterns of social inequality. Wealth and financial security, very relative terms that are not exact, that allow people to have a certain amount of power and control in their life, or they don't. And the fact is, people with more money tend to live longer, healthier lives. We looked at this wider income gap, and income distribution, how income is unevenly distributed in society, at what a welfare state is, how education absolutely contributes to inequality, and where this income inequality comes from. Human capital theory is us investing in ourselves as hoping and trusting it will pay off at some point in the future, and how social and cultural capital affect these. Then we looked at poverty and how poverty is defined in Canada, low income cutoffs, and part of the reason these are so important is the effect on social policy. This politically incorrect idea of a culture of poverty, developed originally by Oscar Lewis, and how children who grow up in an impoverished household learn certain attitudes, values, behaviors, etc. Feminization of poverty, how women are simply more likely to be poor than women. And is this inevitable? Conflict theory, being the pessimist that it is, says yes, stratification is inevitable because the bourgeoisie and the proletariat will never see eye to eye. Functionalism says stratification isn't really inevitable, it is necessary. It is a functional necessity in order to keep society going. Then we have Weber pulling up the rear with the Weberian theory of stratification. He takes a much wider perspective than conflict theory, looking at status groups, parties, and class. Then, social mobility. Do we come from a society where you end up is based on what you're born with or what you do? And do you even have the opportunity for social mobility in society? With this idea, advantage is passed down or it isn't. And lastly, I looked at global inequality. And again, functionalism and conflict theory squabbling like siblings. Functionalism and its modernization theory, talking about how poorer, impoverished countries have dysfunctional ways of doing things, and that's why they stay in the situation they're in. And conflict theory and dependency theory, and how colonization has affected this. And there we go. So your evaluation for this week is your third and last reading reflection, number 3. Dropbox is up. It's ready to go. If you have any questions, again, don't hesitate to contact me. I tend to respond to messages quickly. Otherwise, next week will be race and ethnicity.